Hi, welcome to Danny After Dark. If you're new here, make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss a notification or a new episode. Tonight, I'll be featuring the case of Joel Rifkin. This was a suggestion by two people, friends of the show, Courtney Katona and Ron Haggerty. So thank you both for the recommendation. Now, let's go ahead and find out more. Let's go ahead and dive on in. Joel Rifkin was born on January 20th, 1959. When he was 3 weeks old, he was adopted by Bernard and Jean Rifkin. The couple adopted another child, a daughter, 3 years later. In 1965, the family moved to East Meadow, New York. Joel was a shy and awkward child. Therefore, this made him prone to be bullied. Although he had an IQ of 128, he struggled in school because he was dyslexic. 1977, Joel did manage to finally graduate high school. He then attended the State University at New York in Brockport. While he was there, he worked as a photographer on the school's newspaper, which was called The Stylus. Joel, however, never finished college. He made sporadic attempts to graduate over the next 12 years, all of them unsuccessful. Throughout the 1980s, Joel worked a series of odd jobs around the Long Island area. Joel ended up moving out of his parents' home several times, and he would rent small apartments. But he was never really gone too long. He would always move back home in with his parents when the latest job at the time he had would fall through. February 1987. This was a horrific time for Joel and his family. Joel's adopted father, who had cancer, ended up committing suicide. Joel, as a result of this, became so depressed and developed an obsession with violence, murder, and prostitutes. August 22nd, 1987, Joel was arrested for soliciting a prostitute in Hempstead, Long Island. He was able, however, to make sure that his family did not find out about this. April 1991, Joel started his own landscaping business. He would rent space at a local nursery to store his equipment. Another place he would store his equipment was at his parents' home. June 28th, 1993, police spotted Joel's pickup truck. It did not have any license plates on it. He was on the Southern State Parkway. They tried to pull Joel over. Well, instead of pulling over, he just kept driving at a very fast speed. He ended up crashing into a lamp pole. Police drew their weapons, and that was when Joel stepped out of his truck and handed them his license. But it was too late. Police started to detect a very strong odor from the back of Joel's truck. They also noticed something long and thick, wrapped in plastic, and it was bound with rope. The smell was of a dead body. The body was Tiffany Bresciani, his final victim. Joel said that he had had sex with her, and then he killed her. He was on his way to dump her body near the Republic Airport when he was spotted and stopped by police officers. Now, Joel was in police custody, and the police got way more than they were expecting. Joel confessed, but he also confessed to other murders. In total, 17 murders, all prostitutes, over a span of 4 years. Well, let's go back a little bit. 1989, Joel recalled a woman named Susie. He beat her and strangled her to death. Her dismembered body was tossed in the woods and in the East River. 1990, a woman named Julie Blackbird. Julie was beaten with a heavy table leg before being strangled. Her corpse was then dismembered. The head, arms, and legs were placed in buckets, weighted with concrete. The torso was filled in a milk crate by itself. Julie's head and torso were disposed of in the East River. Her weighted arms and legs were dropped into a Brooklyn barge canal. 1991 comes along, and Joel killed many women during that year. One of those victims was 31 years old, Barbara Jacobs. She was found strangled. Her body was decomposed in the Hudson River. She had been wedged inside of a plastic bag, then forced into a cardboard box. Another 31-year-old victim was Yoon Lee. When she was discovered, it was in the East River on September 23, 1991. Her body was folded inside of a steamer trunk. Next, 22-year-old Mary Ellen DeLuca. She had been missing for about a month when her naked, strangled body was found in a field upstate at Cornwall, New York. Next, number six, because Joel could not identify the name of the victim. So she became simply known as number 6, and the remains have not been located. The next victim, 28-year-old Lorraine Orvieto. She was found strangled a few days before Christmas. She was jammed in a 55-gallon oil drum, and she was dropped off into Coney Island Creek. Her body remained there for over 6 months. Next, a Jane Doe victim was retrieved from Newtown Creek, located in Greenpoint, Brooklyn. Next victim, known as number 9, because again, Joel could not identify her by name. And that is all we know about number 9. Next was 39-year-old Marianne Holloman. She was found in an oil drum from Coney Island Creek. Next, Lorraine Orvieto. The skeletal remains were found, and they were found nearby by people passing. Soon after, another woman was found in an oil drum. She was located in the Harlem River. Joel couldn't remember her name or when he dropped her body in the river. So that is what we know of that victim. Next, Violet O'Neill, 21 years old. She was strangled after Joel brought her back to his mother's and they had sex. He then dismembered her corpse in the bathtub. He disposed of her body in the waters that surrounded Manhattan. Her torso ended up surfacing in the Hudson River. It was wrapped in black plastic. Her arms and legs were found in a discarded suitcase. 1992, Joel was still on a rampage with his killings. They did not slow down. So first, we start with 25-year-old Iris Sanchez. She was strangled to death. He left her body in a vacant lot. It was beneath a mattress at an airport. Next was Ana Lopez. She was also strangled to death. Her body was dumped in the woods off Interstate 84 in Brewster, New York. The next victim, Jenny Soto. She fought back against Joel by breaking off her fingernails on his face. However, Joel ended up snapping her neck. Next was Mary Catherine Williams. She was 31 years old. Joel brought her to get a fix that night, and then he tried to choke her when she dozed off in his mother's car. Yes, his mother's car. Now we get into 1993. Leah Evans. She was murdered and her body left in rural Northampton. Her skeleton was found, sadly, on Mother's Day. Lauren Marquez. was 28 years old. She was picked up by Joel while she was working 2nd Avenue. She also fought him as he tried to strangle her until he snapped her neck. Joel then dumped her body into the Suffolk County Pine Barrens. Now, police ended up questioning Joel for 8 hours, but for some reason, they did not record these sessions. Joel later claimed that he asked for a lawyer, quote, at least 20 times, end quote, and was always refused. Investigators telling him he couldn't speak to counsel until, quote, you give us one more homicide, end quote. The written transcript of this interview, presumably constructed from memory, suggests that Joel was offered a lawyer and declined. He described all 17 murders, writing out the names, the ones that he remembered their names, and sketching maps to help police find those victims that were still missing. That is how a lot of these victims were found, from Joel's direction. With police now having Joel's confessions, they descended on Jean Rifkin's home, his mother's, to search for evidence. Well, in Joel's room, police discovered dozens of ID cards, driver's licenses, credit cards, photographs, articles of jewelry, and piles of women's clothing. And what did they have in common? They belonged to his victims. In the garage, police found a wheelbarrow and a chainsaw that was stained with human remains. Neighbors had noticed a foul odor coming from the Rifkin garage. Although corpses were occasionally stored there before disposal, the odor was actually attributed to fertilizer and insecticide that Joel used for his business. Despite Joel's confessions and the overwhelming evidence against him, for trial, he pled not guilty. Joel's lawyer sought to have his confession just completely thrown out on the grounds that police could not prove that he was ever advised of his Miranda rights. Failing that, he hoped a jury would be more inclined to find Joel not guilty by reason of insanity. However, a formal suppression hearing was scheduled, but before that, Joel fired his lawyer and he retained 2 new lawyers. What we need to keep in mind is November 8th, 1993. The suppression hearing then convened before Judge Ira Wexner, and the judge was having none of Joel's games. Midway through the hearing, Assistant District Attorney offered Joel what was considered a sweetheart deal: 46 years to life on all of the 17 murders in return for a blanket guilty plea. Well, Joel, he refused the deal. He was convinced that he would be acquitted on grounds of insanity. April 11th, 1994, jury selection began for Joel's trial. April 20th, 1994, this is when the opening arguments began. The prosecution described Joel as a sexual sadist who relished in victims' suffering. The defense described Joel as a paranoid schizophrenic who, quote, lived in the twilight zone, end quote, overwhelmed by violent, irresistible compulsions that, quote, took control of his life, end quote. Long Island psychiatrist Barbara Kerwin deemed Joel's psychological tests results, quote, the most pathological, end quote, that she had seen in 20 years of practice. Appearing for the state was Dr. Park Dietz. Yes, the famous Dr. Park Dietz. earlier a prosecution witness against Arthur Shawcross, Jeffrey Dahmer, and John Hinckley, just to name a few names he's worked with. He found Joel, quote, sick, but not insane. He knew exactly what he was doing, and he did it, end quote. 1994, Joel Rifkin was found guilty of 9 murders in total. He was sentenced to 203 years to life in prison. He will be eligible for parole in 2197. He will be the age of 238. And that is the case of Joel Rifkin. Thank you for sticking around for another episode of Danny After Dark. And thank you to Courtney Katona and Ron Haggerty for the recommendation. Do you have any questions or comments about this case? Leave it down below and let's be interactive. Do you have a suggestion for a case that you'd like me to cover? Leave it down below. You may see it featured in an upcoming episode. Until next time, remember, we don't live in darkness. Darkness lives in us.